Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is Michael Bungay Stanier. Even though he's trying to get away from me, we got him for the next.
I was going to go and pick up my ukulele. I have a ukulele in the corner over there. I was going to pretend that I was playing your theme music, but the video cut out too quickly.
That's great. I will tell everybody about you in just a moment. Grace Under Pressure is a show that deals with the things that we too often discard, which are the soft stuff, the caring, the connecting, the compassion we exert toward others. And when you do it as a leader, such as Michael is, because he's also not only is an author, is a CEO. It's all about bringing people together for common cause and energizing the organization. Welcome, Michael Bungay Stanier.
John Baldoni, thank you for having me on this great show. I'm so excited to be here.
Great.
Thanks to everybody listening in as well.
Great. I want to tell everybody about you. Michael's best known for his new book, his book, The Coaching Habit, which is about coaching, surprisingly, and has sold close to 1 million copies and has thousands, literally thousands of 5-star reviews online. I don't even know why I'm talking to you. I'm so insanely jealous. His latest book is called The Advice Trap, and it talks about taming the advice monster. We'll talk all about that in just a moment. Michael, as I said, is a CEO, or actually stepped aside, but founded Box of Crayons, a learning and development company that helps organizations move from advice-driven to curiosity-led, an exciting concept. They've trained hundreds of thousands of managers from companies you might have heard of, like Microsoft, and brands you might know, Gucci. So Michael his home country is Australia. He was to be a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, and where his only significant achievement was falling in love with a Canadian. That's a good thing. And Michael now lives in Toronto, if I'm not mistaken, correct? Okay. When he also lives in,
I'm in Sydney at the moment because I'm in quarantine on my way to visit my parents. But normally in Toronto.
Okay. Anyway, but Michael is a wonderful raconteur, and we'll delve into some of his stories. So welcome, Michael, and sorry for interrupting you in the middle of the night here. So
no worries. It was worth getting up just so that you could call me a raconteur. I'm not even sure what that is, but I'm pretty happy to be one.
Good. It's a raccoon that tells stories. So anyway, so I always ask guests like you, because you're in the thick of it, as we all are. Executives are under a lot of pressure these days. What are you hearing?
Everything. Some people going, this is actually an interesting time for us and we're making some really interesting changes. Everybody going, this is a really hard time for us and we're making some changes. So it's it doesn't take much imagination actually just to imagine. It's like, what the hell's going on? What happened to my plans? How are my people doing? How's my business doing? There's so many businesses that are just trying to reinvent themselves particularly at a kind of small and medium-sized business level, but all organizations are going, what the hell just happened here?
Right.
So I think there's the certainty of, I think I've got a plan. I think I know what I'm doing, which is, quite frankly, always been slightly diluted, if you think that's true. That delusion is harder to hold on to these days.
Right. Well, you are someone who is making the best of this, I will say, in a situation, because you have stepped down from the successful company, Box of Crayons, and you're doing something different. So tell us about that before we jump into the advice trap.
Sure. So I founded a company called Box of Crayons, as you said, a training company about 20 years ago, and where, to my very great surprise, it took off and it grew and it became a multi-million-dollar company. And I, quite frankly, was amazed that I could make it as an entrepreneur just by myself. I was like, there's no real history of that in my family. So the whole idea that I've somehow managed to sell stuff to people and that I can make a living from it was already pretty amazing. Even more amazing to go, wait, there's a company that's bigger than I am now. So 18 months or so ago, I handed it over to one of my colleagues in the company, Shannon Minifee, to become CEO. And turns out Shannon is a genius. I mean, she's just brilliant. I love her to bits, she's also a far better CEO than I ever was or ever will be. Even though she's never done that before, she's just got the wiring,
Right.
and the focus and the discipline and the courage to be a great CEO. So I stepped aside in July, a year and a half ago. And of course, Shannon had a bit of time, 6 months or so, to figure out just what it means to be a CEO. And then the pandemic hits, and now she's really figuring it out to be a CEO. And then she went on maternity leave. So she's figuring out how to be a CEO whilst raising 2 small kids as well.
What a great story. But I think that you touched on something and I've heard this from so many entrepreneurs, and one, in fact, told me, this is years ago, resonated with me. You could tell he was doing a good job when he spent time on the golf course. And he wasn't being facetious, because it was a company that had franchisees, and he would spend time with his franchisees. And he said, hire a great CEO, which is what you have done. So
I have done that.
Yeah.
And it's, for me, if I really think about what what I might be good at, and it's not a very long list, John, so I have to be really clear about it.
Ukulele?
But one of the things that I like doing, and I feel like I can do well, is bring new ideas into the world. So, or maybe a better way of putting it is putting old ideas, old wine into new bottles. I mean, because the books you reference, The Coaching Habit, which is the book that has been incredibly and delightfully and surprisingly successful. It's like, it basically says curiosity is a good thing. Here are 7 great questions. And it's not like I came up with this great idea that questions are good and people should start thinking about that. People have been talking about that for millennia. Yeah. But I like trying to make ideas feel simple and practical and accessible and everyday. I mean, I'm very driven, for instance, in coaching, to kind of democratize coaching so that it doesn't stay in that kind of weird corner where you're like a life coach or you're in HR or whatever. But it's like, no, coaching is a way of showing up and being with each other and being with other people around you. Let me show you how to make it just an everyday, unweird thing, being more coach-like.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the themes of grace is the connectedness we feel toward one another. And coaching simply is an expression of that. So let's jump in. I have my own copy of advice.
Beautiful.
There it is.
Very nice.
And so tell us about what you wrote, a very phenomenally successful book on coaching, The Coaching Habit. Which, most coaching books sell, 50 copies. You sell mostly 1 million. But so why did you, what's the advice trap all about?
Yeah, because why write another book? Because, as you say, I mean,
somebody tell me that, because I've done 14 now.
And it's really hard, isn't it? I mean, it's hard to write a book. It's even harder to write a good book. It's even harder to sell a good book. So, my guess is that if you look at your 14 books, there's a bell curve, and there's been 1 or 2 at the top end that have sold pretty well. And there's been 1 or 2 at the bottom end that have sold almost nothing. And you're like, why? And then there's a bunch of ones in the middle where you're like, they've sold okay. Yeah. But it's like, it's a hard way to get your point of view out into the world. It is. So why would you write a book? And,
so I'm getting small. People will notice I'm getting smaller and smaller here, Michael. Thank you very much for being this guest.
Well, it's more a recognition of helping people who are listening to understand, like, being an author is a decision of blood, sweat, and tears. I mean, really, somebody once said, writing is easy. You stare at a blank sheet of paper till drops of blood appear on your forehead. So it's like, okay. And that's partly why things like this LinkedIn Live and podcasts and the like are really interesting, because they're new and different ways of bringing content and opinions and tools and points of views into the world that don't require quite as much agony as book writing. So why write a book? Yeah. Well, so, with 1 million copies sold or near to it on The Coaching Habit, I know that it's like that bell curve again. I know there are some people who've read the book on the bell curve and are at this end, or maybe it's this end, depending on how your screen works, who go, I love this book. It's amazing. I read it, and it has literally changed the way that I lead and I show up and I interact with the people around me. It allows me to use your words to bring more grace into the world, because you get to show up in a connected way with the people that you're there. And honestly, I love people like that. And I love getting their emails, which I get regularly, going, this is just a really helpful, decent book. Thank you. I'm like, my pleasure. There's also people at the other end of the bell curve who go, this book sucks. I mean, honestly, this is a hopeless book. I hate it. I hate coaching. I hate your book. I hate your bizarre sense of humor. I think it could have been a blog post, and a really short blog post. In fact, why isn't it just 7 sentences, each one with a question in it? And I'm like, look, you're fine. I'm just not the right person for you right now.
Yeah.
There's literally a woman who wrote on Amazon, this is the worst book ever written. And I'm like, I get not liking the book, but I suspect it's not the worst book ever written. Just saying.
Well, I thought that's funny. It reminds me of a dear friend of mine whose daughter, when she was 15, a couple of friends have said this, and I looked at her father and said, "You're the worst father in the world." And she, both now, she's gone on to success, and all the other young women have too. So it's funny perspective.
But it's the people in the middle that I tried to write the advice track for. These are people who go, look, Michael, I quite enjoyed the book. I like the 7 questions that you talk about. I can see how they'd be helpful. And yet, for some reason, I'm really struggling to change my behavior so that I can be more coach-like. And they're the people who I wrote the advice track for, which is like, okay, so in theory, coaching or being more coach-like is pretty easy. Because here's the summary of the behavior: stay curious a little bit longer, rush to action and advice giving a little more slowly. That sounds easy enough. But for most of us, it's actually pretty hard. Most of us are advice giving maniacs. Somebody starts talking to us, and after about 3 seconds, we're like, oh, I know what's going on. Sure, I'll pretend to keep listening here, but mostly I'm just waiting for a gap so I can now start telling you some ideas, some solutions, some suggestions, some opinions, all of that sort of stuff.
You're not referring to me, are you, Michael?
I am. I'm specifically talking to you around this, John. You're the worst. You're the worst father and advice giver who's ever lived.
Well, thank you very much. This affirmation is just humbling.
I'm really here to. This is called the Kick John Baldoni show, right? Isn't it? Oh no, it's great. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed the point. So I was like, okay, so how do you shift your behavior? How do you actually get into trying to change? If you want to change, how do you change to be more curious? And that's kind of where I came up with this idea that's at the heart of this book, which is, how do you tame your advice monster?
I love that term, advice monster. Yes.
It's people when I go, you've got an advice monster, when I talk to rooms about it, everybody in the room goes, oh my God, it's true. I have an advice monster. I can feel my advice monster.
Yeah.
So the advice monster is, it's a metaphor for the behavior that just seems to carry on unchanged, even though we want it to be changed. So I'm like, okay, rather than just going, all I was missing were some tools. Those are the 7 questions. This is a kind of deeper exploration of behavior change, which is, how do you tame your advice monster? What's going on with that?
Right. That's great. And, there's when I read this book, it cottoned on something to me. And going back to Grace, there's one of the stories I tell in Grace is about Father Greg Boyle, who founded the Homeboy Industries in South Central LA, which works with finding ex-gang members jobs. And he always talks a lot about, in a sense, the advice monster. I go up to you, Michael, and I say, how you doing? And all of a sudden I'm saying, Michael, I want you to boom, 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 this. How about just sitting down with you? And it takes patience. And people like me have no patience. So,
right. Yeah. Well, people like you means like people like most people, because we've spent a lifetime of being told it's good to have the answer. So there's been all sorts of ways that we've been rewarded and encouraged to stick up your hand and go, let me tell you something. Yeah. Secondly, most of us are trying to help. So there's one part of this which is well-intended. But there's a shadow side to it as well. And the shadow side is, first of all, your advice isn't actually that great. It doesn't work as well as you think it does. Secondly, you're trying to solve the wrong problem most of the time. So your advice, even if it was good, it wouldn't even be on target. Yeah. And thirdly, kind of more profoundly, it's disempowering is a kind of jargony word, but at a fundamental level, it's a little dehumanizing, because when your advice monster is in control, meaning that you're just reactively going into advice giving, because just as an aside, John, obviously there's times and places where giving advice is exactly the right thing to be doing.
Sure.
But when your advice monster is in control, there's one part of you that is basically saying, I'm better than you. I'm better than the other person. I'm faster, smarter, more experienced, younger, morally superior. There's all sorts of ways where you're going, let me just explain why I'm better than you. And when your advice monster is in control, it is not a moment of grace.
True, and that's so. Did you bring a copy of this? And may I ask you to read a quick chat?
Sure,
please.
My
And I have to tell folks, I do invite authors to read a bit of a passage, and this is an idea that I stole from you, Michael.
Exactly.
All credits go to you. So.
My pleasure. And just as an aside, before I read this out, literally this week, we released the audiobook of The Advice Trap. So it's now available for me reading the whole thing out. But what's really cool is that I've asked different people at the end of each chapters to kind of chip in and contribute their perspective on the chapter. So some of the people are, colleagues that we both have in common, John, because we're both members of the Marshall Goldsmith 100. So it's like Alexander Osterwalder, author of the business model books, Pau Gasol, the NBA and all-star, the basketball player, he's reading a few chapters. And I've got Shannon, who's the CEO who took over from me. She's reading a few chapters. It's a really interesting, diverse bunch of people reflecting on the book. But sure, what would you like me to read, John?
Talk about the one that jumps out at me is let's see, Foggifier. Is that something?
Yeah. Let me
First of all, I love the word Foggifier.
Yeah, sure.
Because I think I live in a perpetual world of fog, so maybe it's a positive.
So I'm just going to read the intro to the Foggifiers, and the context for this is it comes in a chapter called Find the Real Challenge. And the insight that I'd love people to hear is to say, look, if you can shift the way you show up in the world from the person who has the advice to the person who helps you figure out what the real problem is, you become more beloved, more strategic, more valuable, more helpful to those around you. In the Coaching Habit book, I introduced the focus question, which is, what's the real challenge here for you? And just kind of go, look, it's just worth banging on with that question a bit right at the start of a conversation, because it helps you get into figuring out what's the real thing we're trying to solve here. What's the real problem? Because there's no point in coming up with a fast answer that solves the wrong problem. And actually, we spend our lives, particularly in organizations, seeming to do that. So I'll read a couple of pages. So the heading is Change the Game You're Playing. Sometimes you win by not playing the game. The game the advice monster wants you to play is about having the best answer. This, it whispers in your ear, is how you add value, how you save the world, how you stay in control, how you stave off the fear of failure, how you show your quality. Always have the idea. Always have the answer.
Yeah.
You can be known as the person who helps articulate the critical issue, or as the person who provides hasty answers to solve the wrong problem. Which would you prefer? Exactly. From now on, frame your role as helping to find the real challenge. What this really means is being relentless, staying curious long enough to allow the other person to create the insight and space to reach the heart of the matter. And then 6 Foggifiers. I'm going to just give you the overview of this. There are 6 ways that people trip themselves up and fail to uncover the real challenge. These are the Foggifiers, patterns of conversation that stop you getting clear on what matters. The first 2, twirling and coaching the ghost, are traps the person coaching that's you, can fall into. The remainder are patterns of behavior that you'll see in the person you're coaching and which you're looking to address. Each foggifier is different, but thankfully, there's a pattern on how best to deal with them. First, notice the foggifier. Until you do that, it's hard to know how to act. The foggifier is the other person behaving in a way that will keep them from finding the real challenge if you and your advice monster choose to collaborate with them. Second, the second part of the process, say what you see. You're not making a big thing of it. You're just making explicit, for your sake and theirs, what's happening in the conversation. That way, you'll both get smarter as to what patterns are going on. And finally, ask a question. And not just any question, but the focus question to clear away the foggifier. The focus question is something of a master key in solving the foggifiers. Whether it's settling, that's one of the names of the foggifiers, popcorning, big picturing, yarning, or one of the other foggifiers, what's the real challenge here for you is your go-to question. Although, as you'll see, the emphasis you put on the syllables can make subtle but significant differences.
Great. Thank you. I love
My pleasure.
you read this. So this will be a wonderful shout out to the Audible version, which is an augmented version because other voices too. So
it is. It's like there's like an hour's extra worth of content in there. So if anybody is actually listening and you're going, which one? It's so new, and I think it might be my favorite version of it because it's got such a nice, diverse range of input into it.
Great. One of the things, a theme in your company, but also the first book, The Coaching Habit, and now Advice Trap, is curiosity. Why is curiosity? It's so integral, but we overlook it.
Yeah. Look, I think it is a superpower because I think curiosity is one of the pathways to grace. I mean, John, how do you talk about grace? Tell me what the core elements of grace are for you.
Well, I look at grace as the impetus for positive change. It's a catalyst for good. We express it by being generous, by being compassionate, and by showing respect. And I amplified it a bit, twisted it, or if you will, to a leadership thing, because leaders think, yes, but leaders act and they energize. So that's how I encapsulate it.
Yeah. So that state of generosity and compassion that you talk about. So how do you do that? How do you be generous? How do you be compassionate? How do you help people act? And I think if you can show up with a little more curiosity, you set yourself up for the opportunities to do that. It's a foundational orientation that kind of allows the other stuff to happen. They become positive byproducts of somebody who is curiosity led.
And that's a key thought, because you say, how do you be generous? Well, and it gets back to the it's show up.
Yeah.
And then it comes to listening. And where do I meet you? That's the cure. And you will only know that if you're curious.
Yeah. I mean, to go kind of a little philosophical, I'm sure you know Martin Buber's work, right? And I've read it once, but I don't claim to be an expert in it. But I've always been very grabbed by his simple but powerful model, because the powerful models are often the simplest, where he says there are two types of relationships in the world. There's I-it relationships and I-thou relationships.
Yes.
And I-it relationships, as I understand them, are where you see the other person as slightly less than human. They're a role, they're a cipher, they're an object. Whereas I-thou relationships are where you have a chance to kind of connect to their humanity. You see them for the full human being they are, which has to come from a place of you feeling your full humanity as well.
And it requires humility, which is critical, because you talk about it in Advice Trap, because as you said, the impetus to give advice is my feeling of superiority. Well,
Yeah.
time out.
Yeah, exactly. So curiosity allows, and on a kind of really practical level, it drives, I mean, particularly in business context, John, because I know you and I talk about that all the time, but it drives better impact. Because if you're curious, you're more likely to figure out what the real problems are that need to be solved. Right. And you're more likely to generate a wider range of ideas that help solve them. Right. And you're also likely to have people who are more engaged because you're actually engaging with them and connecting with them in a more human way. You're kind of helping them, empower them, and give them more confidence and competence and autonomy and self-sufficiency. All of that is the kind of practical way that curiosity shows up. But as you say in the book, I talk about these 3 attributes of leadership that get released through curiosity. And it's empathy and mindfulness and humility. That's the one you mentioned already. That's why I was getting confused. And if you think about them, they form a nice little system, because humility is about a more subtle awareness of who you are and how you're showing up in the world, kind of grounded. It's not necessarily, I don't think humility is denying your strengths. It's just understanding your strengths and your weaknesses. Yeah. Empathy is being a more subtly, more nuanced around the person across the table from you. Mm-hmm. And curiosity is essential to that. Right. And mindfulness, I'm using it in that broader sense of just being more nuanced and understanding about what's going on around you, more present to the reality. Mm-hmm. And all 3 of those elements are woven into curiosity.
Right. It's such a pleasure when listening to you and reading your books, because I will tell folks, if you haven't read Michael's work, please do. It's like having a conversation, because you write, you speak. And I say that as a positive. And when you were reading that passage, it's really a conversation with yourself, but what the beauty of it is, it's tangible and practical. Yeah. So, have you considered coaching?
Well, ironically, I don't really do any coaching because, and this is a different conversation really, but in terms of like figuring out what your strengths are and what your contribution might be, right. I'm an okay coach, but I wouldn't call myself a really great coach, and I wouldn't call myself inflamed by the passion of going, this is the thing for me. Yeah. Whereas teaching is a much greater passion from who I am, teaching and facilitating. And it's more attractive to me. So, I built a coaching practice when I started my business and then dismantled it not that long after, because I'm like, wow, I was so sure that this would be the thing I wanted to do. And it turns out this is not the thing I want to do. I want to write books. I want to be on a stage. I want to be talking to an audience.
Well, that's great. Sadly, we are coming to close to the end.
What? You just got started.
So I do always ask a guest, do you have a story of grace that you'd like to share with us, Michael?
Well, it's more a practice, and I've been doing it for a little bit, like some months rather than some years. Mm-hmm. But when I wake up in the morning, I'm really trying to resist the temptation to flip open my inbox and then kind of get swallowed by email. So I sit on a cushion or a chair or a little yoga block, and this practice called a Buddhist practice called Tonglen. And I'm sure you know what this is, John, but as I understand it, you breathe in the world's pain and you breathe out goodness. Mm-hmm. And there are various people in my life right now who are going through a hard time, all sorts of variations on what a hard time is. Mm-hmm. So I spend 5 to 10 minutes, just sitting, legs crossed, eyes closed, and I just bring people to mind, and I try and bring in some of their pain, and I try and breathe out good vibes to them. Right. And, I'm surprised to find myself doing this, because it drives me nuts when, there's some sort of tragedy and somebody goes, we're sending thoughts and prayers. I'm like, that is such a escape from actually taking on the challenging thing of offering real help or changing a system or whatever it might be. Thoughts and prayers. What the hell's that good for that?
Yeah.
But here I am sending thoughts and prayers on my little box. But I'm trying to put myself in the middle of that. And it doesn't stop me needing to then reach out to those people and talk to them and support them in more practical, tangible ways. But for me, this practice of Tonglen is proving a little moment of grace.
Great. Well, thank you. It's a wonderful story. I would call it grace in process and through process. And you are exercising humility. I'm part of the world, but you're also empathy. I am feeling the world and bringing it toward me. And that's a powerful thing. Michael, I'm sad to say our conversation is coming to an end. How can people find you? Because I want people to find you. So.
Thanks, John. The best place. I mean, if you're in a big organization and if you have a huge training budget, then head over to boxofcrayons.com because we'd love to talk to you. But if you're not that person, or even if you are that person, come and visit me at mbs.works, which is my personal website. The thing that people might be most interested in is I have something called the Year of Living Brilliantly. It is a year-long program, totally free. And you get a short video every week from a different teacher. So I've got 52 amazing different teachers there. And it is just as it says, if you want a better year than the year you've just had, this is a really free, great resource with a lovely community that might provide some useful teaching for you.
Great. Well, we will put that link in the descriptions. And Michael, you are a man of grace, and it's been my privilege to speak to you today. And thank you for getting up in the middle of the night and speaking to us.
So. Lovely to talk to you, John, as always. Thank you.